The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stone floors of the kennels, seeping through the thin soles of her worn-out boots. It clung to the damp straw she changed every morning, and it settled deep in her bones, a permanent ache that reminded her of what she was: an omega, the lowest of the low, less than nothing. Ilara's fingers were stiff as she broke apart the frozen block of meat, her knuckles raw and red. A low growl rumbled from the corner of the pen. She didn't look up. She knew it was Fang, the largest of the new feral pups, the one with eyes like chips of flint, and a snarl that had sent two hardened pack warriors scrambling out of the enclosure last week. They were her charge, the broken ones. The pups born in the wild, dragged back to the citadel after their mothers were killed by rival packs or winter's brutal embrace. They were deemed too wild, too dangerous to be integrated. So they were given to her. The broken things for the broken girl. Another growl, closer this time. The smell of fear and aggression, sharp and acrid, filled the small space. Ilara kept her movements slow, deliberate. She pushed a chunk of meat forward with a stick, not her hand. She'd made that mistake once, a long time ago. The scars that crisscrossed the back of her right hand, a pale, puckered web, were a daily reminder of her foolishness, of the pain that came from offering a gentle hand to a world that only knew teeth. She didn't blame the pup that had mauled her. It was just scared. Everything was, out here on the frozen edge of the world. Once the meat was distributed, she retreated to the far wall, sinking down onto the cold stone. The pups tore into the food, their savage little snarls echoing in the gloom. This was the worst part of the day, the waiting. She couldn't leave them until they were done, lest they turn on each other. So she sat, invisible, and let the cold have its way with her. Her stomach growled in pathetic jealousy. She would get her portion later after everyone else had eaten. It was usually thin broth and a crust of stale bread, enough to keep her alive, not enough to ever feel warm. A whimper broke through the sounds of feeding. It was the smallest pup, the one she called Willow, huddled in the far corner. Fang had shouldered her away from the food, and now she shivered, her tiny body trembling with cold and fear. Ilara's heart, a stupid, tender thing that refused to harden, ached for the pup. She knew that feeling, the bone-deep certainty that you were not wanted, that there was no place for you at the fire. Without thinking, she began to hum. It was a low, quiet sound, barely audible over the wind whistling through the cracks in the kennel walls. It was a melody without words, one her mother had hummed to her before she'd been taken by the lung fever. It was the only thing she had left of her. The growling began to subside. Fang lifted his bloody snout, his ears twitching. He stared at her, his flinty eyes narrowed with suspicion. Ilara's hum deepened, a thread of sound weaving through the cold air. She let the notes rise and fall, pouring all the loneliness, all the quiet grief she carried into the simple tune. She wasn't singing for them, not really. She was singing for herself. For the little girl who had lost her mother and then her father and then her standing. For the Omega who sat in the dirt and dreamed of being warm. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Fang lowered his head. He nudged a piece of meat with his nose toward the whimpering pup, Willow. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. He had never done that before. Feeling a flicker of courage, she let words attach themselves to the melody. They were simple words, about warm hearths and gentle hands, about a son she could barely remember. Her voice was thin, unused to anything but whispered pleasantries and apologies, but it didn't waver. One by one, the feral pups stopped eating. They turned their gazes on her, their wild eyes losing some of their sharpness. The tension bled out of the enclosure, replaced by a strange, quiet stillness. Willow crept forward and took the meat, gobbling it down without a single growl from the others. When the last pup had finished eating, They didn't retreat to their corners to snarl and snap. They settled into the straw, their bodies curling into tight balls. A few of them even crept closer to where Alara sat, their bellies full, their eyes heavy-lidded. Fang laid his head on his paws, his gaze fixed on her, a deep sigh shuddering through his small, powerful body. She had done this before, but never with such a profound effect. The song had taken on a life of its own, a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. For a moment, just a moment, she didn't feel the cold stone beneath her. She felt peace. A shadow fell across the doorway. Alara's song died in her throat. Her blood turned to ice, a cold far more terrifying than the winter wind. She scrambled to her feet, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the dirt floor. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The air itself had changed. It had become heavy, charged with a power that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The scent of pine and frozen earth, of ancient ice and ozone before a storm, filled the kennels. The Alpha King. Kalen had not been seen outside the central keep in years. He was a ghost, a legend, a king so old and powerful that his very presence was said to freeze the blood in a wolf's veins. They said he felt nothing. No joy, no anger, no pain. A king of ice, ruling a kingdom of ice. Why was he here? In the kennels? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Had she done something wrong? Was the singing forbidden? Of course it was. An omega making noise, drawing attention to herself. It was a violation. She braced for the blow, for the harsh reprimand. She waited, trembling for his voice, which was said to sound like the cracking of a glacier. Silence. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight. It wasn't angry. It was intense, searching. She dared a glance upward, just a flicker through her lashes. He was massive, broader than the doorway he filled. Clad in black furs and leather, he seemed to absorb the meager light. His face was harsh, carved from granite, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. And his eyes? She had heard they were blue, but they were the blue of a winter sky so cold it had bleached itself of all color. They were pale, almost silver, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving stillness. He wasn't looking at her like she was an omega. He wasn't looking at her with disgust or dismissal. He was looking at her as if he'd never seen a person before. Then his gaze shifted, sweeping over the pups. The pups that should have been a snarling, vicious pack were all asleep, quiet and calm in the straw. Even Fang was dozing, his tail giving a soft, sleepy thump against the ground. The king's silver eyes returned to her. A flicker of something passed through them. Confusion? Disbelief? It was gone before she could name it. He took a step into the kennels, the crunch of his boots on the grimy floor deafeningly loud. Ilara flinched back, pressing herself against the cold stone wall, making herself smaller. He stopped. He didn't come any closer. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, a mask of ice. Centuries of absolute rule had stripped him of any tells, any weakness. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't the crack of a glacier. It was low, a deep rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and up into her bones. It was quieter than she could have ever imagined, and it held a note of something she couldn't identify. A roughness, as if the words were unused to being spoken. He said only one word. You. The word hung in the air between them. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a recognition. As if he had been searching for something for a very long time and had just, impossibly, found it in the filth of the feral kennels. Alara didn't understand. She could only stare, her mind a blank slate of terror and confusion. He was the king, she was nothing, and he was looking at her like she was everything, The world tilted on its axis. The cold she had known her entire life was suddenly overshadowed by a different kind of chill, the terrifying, exhilarating frost of the unknown. He didn't move for a long moment, simply held her gaze. For the first time, Ilara saw past the legend. She saw the man, and in the depths of his impossibly old, impossibly cold eyes, she saw a flicker of something that looked like wonder, and a profound, soul-deep loneliness that echoed her own. Then he turned, his black fur cloak sweeping around him, and was gone. The heavy, charged air dissipated, leaving behind the familiar smells of straw and cold stone. But nothing was the same. Ilara slid down the wall, her legs unable to hold her. She pressed her scarred hand to her mouth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Alpha King had seen her, and nothing, she knew with a terrifying certainty, would ever be the same again. An hour later, 2 royal guards came for her. They didn't speak, their faces grim under their steel helms. They flanked her as she walked, their presence a stark contrast to the invisibility she was used to. Every wolf they passed in the castle's lower corridors stopped and stared. Whispers followed them like the rustling of dead leaves. They took her from the cold, dark underbelly of the citadel and led her up winding staircases she'd only ever glimpsed. They passed tapestries depicting great battles and portraits of stern-faced alphas from generations past. The air grew warmer, cleaner. The stone floors were polished, covered in thick rugs that swallowed the sound of their footsteps. They stopped before a heavy oak door, intricately carved with wolves and ravens. One of the guards knocked once, a sharp, respectful rap. A voice from within commanded, "Enter." It was his voice, the deep, quiet rumble that had shaken her to her core. The guards opened the door and gestured for her to go inside. Ilara's feet felt like lead. She took a hesitant step into the room, and the door clicked shut behind her, leaving her alone with him. It was a study, vast and imposing. Bookshelves stretched from the floor to the vaulted ceiling, filled with ancient leather-bound tomes. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting flickering shadows across the room. It was the warmest place she had ever been. King Kalen stood by the fire, his back to her. He was staring into the flames, his hands clasped behind him. The sheer size of him was no less intimidating in this civilized setting. He was a force of nature contained within 4 walls. "Come here," he said, his voice soft, yet it was an undeniable command. She forced her trembling legs to obey, stopping a few feet behind him. She kept her eyes downcast, studying the intricate pattern of the rug. She could feel the heat of the fire on her face. A foreign, shocking sensation. He turned slowly. His silver eyes met hers, and she felt that strange jolt again, like lightning striking a frozen lake. He studied her face, his gaze lingering on the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the frayed collar of her tunic. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ilara, Your Majesty." Her voice was a mouse's squeak. "Ilara," he repeated, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "The song you were singing. Where did you learn it?" "My mother, sire." She swallowed hard. She sang it to me." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "When I entered the kennels," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "the air was warm." Ilara frowned in confusion. "Sire? The kennels are never warm." "No," he agreed, a strange intensity entering his eyes. "They are not. But today they were, around you." He took a step closer and she had to fight the instinct to flee. He stopped just an arm's length away. "For 500 years I have not felt warmth. My blood runs cold. My heart is a stone. It is a curse of my line, a price for our power." He was telling her things no one was meant to know, secrets that could get a person killed. "Why? Why her?" "When I heard your voice," he continued, his gaze hypnotic. It was like hearing a sound after centuries of silence. And when I stepped into that room, I felt it. Heat. For the first time since I was a boy. Alara could only stare, her mind reeling. He thought her song, her, had done that? It was impossible. She was an Omega. She had nothing. No power. No gift. Only a scarred hand and a sad little tune. I don't understand, she whispered, the words honest and raw. Neither do I, he admitted. And for the first time she saw a crack in his icy facade, a fissure of pure, unadulterated confusion. He, the all-powerful, all-knowing Alpha King, was as lost as she was. But I will. He turned away from her, walking towards a small table laden with a silver pitcher and goblets. You will no longer work in the kennels. You will be given chambers in the royal wing. You will have food, clothes, anything you require. The words were a death sentence and a reprieve all at once. To be elevated so suddenly, so publicly, the others would hate her. They would see her as a usurper, a whore who had somehow caught the king's eye. Her life, as miserable as it had been, had at least been simple. This was a gilded cage, and she could already feel the predators circling. This is not a reward, Ilara, he said, as if reading her thoughts. He faced her again, his expression once more a mask of cold authority. It is an arrangement. You will stay where I can. Observe you? You will not speak to anyone of what I have told you. You will simply exist. Do you understand? She nodded numbly, unable to form words. Good. He gestured to the door. The guards will show you to your new quarters. As she turned to leave, her hand on the cold iron handle of the door, his voice stopped her one last time. Ilara. She looked back. He was standing in the firelight, a solitary, imposing figure. Sing again tonight, he said, and it was not a request. I will be listening. Her new chambers were larger than the entire kennel block. A four-poster bed was draped in velvet curtains the color of a midnight sky. A fire, her own fire, blazed in a marble hearth. Gowns of silk and wool lay folded on a chaise lounge, jewels sparkling on a dressing table beside them. It was a dream. It was a nightmare. She touched nothing. She stood in the center of the room, still in her dirt-stained Omega rags, and felt more out of place than she ever had in the straw and filth below. This was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. A servant girl, not much older than her, entered with a tray of food. Real food. Roasted chicken, warm bread, spiced wine. The aroma made Alara's head spin. The girl curtsied low, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, and scurried out without a word. Alara ate, because she was starving. Each bite was an agony of guilt. Who was she to deserve this? But her body, long denied, craved the sustenance. After she had eaten her fill, she walked to the tall, arched window. It overlooked the central courtyard of the citadel. Below, she could see pack members moving about, their faces lit by torches. They looked so small from up here. She was a prisoner, a specimen in a jar. The king wasn't being kind, he was being clinical. He thought she was some sort of anomaly, a curiosity to be studied. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold through her, a chill that even the roaring fire couldn't touch. That night she sat by the window for hours, watching the stars appear in the inky sky. She thought of his words. I will be listening. She didn't want to sing. Her voice was a private thing, a comfort for herself and the broken pups. To use it as a command performance felt like a violation. But the alternative, disobeying the Alpha King, was unthinkable. So she sang. She sang the same lullaby, her voice small and hesitant in the cavernous room. She sang of her mother, of a life she barely remembered. And as she sang, she wept, silent tears tracking paths through the dirt on her cheeks. She wept for her lost life, and for the terrifying new one that had been forced upon her. She didn't know if he heard her. She felt no change in the air, no sense of his presence. But she sang until her throat was raw, and then she crawled into the massive empty bed, feeling smaller and more alone than ever before. Days bled into weeks. Life became a strange routine. She ate the fine food, wore the beautiful gowns, but spoke to no one. The servants treated her with a terrified reverence, scurrying away from her as if she might curse them. The whispers followed her whenever she dared to walk the corridors. They called her the Omega Witch, the king's pet. He visited her nightly. He would appear at her door without a sound, a shadow in the firelight. He never touched her. He rarely spoke. He would simply sit in a chair across the room and watch her. Sometimes he would bid her to sing. Other times, he would just sit in silence, his silver eyes fixed on her, his face a mask of impenetrable cold. But she started to see things, tiny things, the way the muscles in his jaw would unclench when she sang, the way his gaze would soften for a fraction of a second when he looked at her, the way he sometimes held his hand near the fire, as if trying to remember what heat felt like. She began to understand. He wasn't studying her. He was basking. Like a man dying of thirst who had found a single drop of water. She was his warmth, his only warmth. The thought was terrifying. The responsibility of it was crushing. But it also planted a tiny, dangerous seed in the barren soil of her heart. A seed of purpose. A seed of hope. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the suffocating luxury of her rooms, she found a forgotten conservatory at the top of the western tower. It was a glass dome, filled with exotic plants from warmer lands, most of them withered and dying from neglect and the biting northern cold. In the center of the room stood a single barren rose bush, its thorny branches black and brittle. A plaque at its base read, "The Sun Rose of Eldoria, a gift from Queen Lyra." His mother. It must have been here for centuries. Feeling a kinship with these dying things, Ilara began to visit the conservatory every day. She would sit by the dead rose bush and sing her quiet songs. She wasn't trying to work any magic. She was just lonely, and the plants didn't whisper behind her back. A week later, she noticed it. A tiny speck of green on one of the black, thorny branches. A new bud. She stared at it, her heart pounding. It was impossible. The bush was dead. It had been dead for a century. But there it was, a tiny, defiant spark of life. That evening, when Kaelin came to her chambers, he found her staring into her fire, a strange expression on her face. "You seem troubled," he observed. His voice, once so jarring, had become a familiar rumble. "The rosebush in the conservatory," she said, not looking at him. "It's growing a new bud." He was silent for so long that she thought he hadn't heard her. When she finally dared to look at him, his face was pale, his silver eyes wide with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. It looked like shock. It looked like fear. "My mother planted that rose," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It died the day she did. 500 years ago." He stood up abruptly and strode from the room without another word, leaving Ilara with the terrifying realization that her simple song was not so simple after all. She had a power she didn't understand, a power that could bring life to dead things, and a power that was drawing the attention of very dangerous people. Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor, was a man made of shadows and whispers. He had served Kaelin's father and his father before him. His face was a web of fine lines, his eyes dark and clever. He had watched Ilara's elevation from the kennels with a cold, calculating gaze. He found her in the conservatory the next day. She was humming to the rosebush, which now boasted 3 new buds. "An omega with a green thumb," he said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "How Quaint. Alara flinched and fell silent, her head bowed. The king takes a great interest in you, Valerius continued, circling her slowly. It is most unusual. He has shown no interest in anything for a very long time. It makes one wonder. What sort of tricks does a kennel rat learn in the dirt? I don't know any tricks, my lord, she whispered. No? He stopped in front of her, forcing her to look up at him. His smile was thin and cruel. Be careful, little bird. The king's favor is a fickle thing. Cages that seem gilded are still cages. And there are many in this castle who believe a creature like you does not belong outside of one. His threat was veiled, but the malice behind it was sharp and real. He saw her not as a curiosity, but as a disruption to the order he had so carefully maintained for centuries. The king was a predictable force of cold logic. This girl made him unpredictable. And Valerius did not like things he could not predict. The fear he ignited in her was a cold counterpoint to the warmth she felt growing in the king's presence. She was walking a knife's edge, and the chasm below was dark and deep. That night, Kaelin asked her to sing for him again. But this time, when she finished, he didn't just watch her from his chair. He rose and walked to her, stopping so close she could feel the chill that radiated from his body. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment in the air before he gently, so gently, touched the scars on the back of her hand. His fingers were like ice, but his touch was feather light. It sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice rough. "A pup," she answered, her voice trembling. "A long time ago. I was careless." His thumb traced the largest scar, a puckered line that ran from her knuckle to her wrist. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, ancient fury. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the memory of her pain. "No one," he vowed, his silver eyes burning with a sudden, fierce light, "will ever harm you again." It was a promise, a vow from a king who had not made one in centuries. And in that moment, looking up at his harsh, beautiful face, Alara felt the last of her fear of him melt away, replaced by something far more dangerous. Something that felt terrifyingly like love. The next morning, the accusations began. It started with a whisper in the kitchens. One of the pack warriors had fallen ill, a strange, wasting sickness that left him weak and delirious. The healers were baffled. By midday, 2 more had collapsed. Panic, ugly and swift, began to spread through the citadel. This was unnatural. This was dark magic. By evening, Lord Valerius had found the source. He, along with a contingent of grim-faced royal guards, burst into Alara's chambers. He held up a small leather pouch. "As I suspected," he announced to the guards, his voice ringing with false sorrow, "nightshade and bloodthorn, the tools of a hedge witch, found hidden beneath her mattress." Alara stared at the pouch, her mind blank with shock. She had never seen it before in her life. "This is a lie," she said, her voice shaking. "I've done nothing." "The Omega Witch denies her crimes," Valerius sneered, turning to the guards. "She has ensnared our king with her foul enchantments, and now she turns her poison on the pack. Our laws are clear on this. Sorcery is punishable by death." The guards grabbed her arms, their grips like iron. She struggled, but it was useless. They dragged her from her rooms, down the grand staircase and into the throne room. The entire court was assembled. Their faces were a sea of hatred and fear, all directed at her. They shoved her to her knees before the throne. Kaelin was already there, his face a mask of thunder. He had clearly been summoned just moments before. He stared down at her, then at Valerius, his silver eyes narrowed to slits. "What is the meaning of this, Valerius?" he growled, the sound echoing off the high stone ceiling. "A necessary precaution, Your Majesty," Valerius said, bowing low. "We have found the source of the sickness plaguing our people. The Omega Girl is a witch. She has woven a spell of enthrallment upon you, and now seeks to destroy us all. We demand her execution, as is her right by ancient law." A roar of agreement went up from the assembled nobles. "Death to the witch!" they cried. Ilara looked up at Kaelin, her heart shattering. This was it. This was the end. He was their king. He had to listen to them. He would sacrifice her to keep the peace. The brief, impossible dream of warmth was over. But Kaelin did not look at the crowd. He looked only at her. His gaze was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. She saw the duty warring with the strange, new feeling she had woken in him. He was the king, a creature of logic and law. But he was also the man who had traced the scars on her hand and promised her safety. Which one would win? "She is under my protection," Kaelin said, his voice dangerously quiet. The room fell silent. "But the law, sire," Valerius protested. "The evidence is clear. The pact demands justice." "I am the law," Kaelin stated, rising from his throne. He was terrifying in his stillness, a predator coiled to strike. "And I say, she is innocent." A gasp went through the crowd. He was defying them, defying ancient law, all for an Omega. Valerius's face twisted in a brief flash of fury before settling back into a mask of concerned loyalty. "Majesty, your judgment is clouded by her spell. We are only trying to protect you, to protect the pack." Suddenly, from the back of the crowd, a figure lunged forward. It was one of the guards, his face contorted in a fanatic's rage. "For the good of the pack!" he screamed, a dagger flashing in his hand. He wasn't aiming for the king. He was aiming for Ilara. Everything slowed down. Ilara saw the glint of steel, the hatred in the man's eyes. She was frozen, paralyzed by the certainty of her own death. But Kaelin moved faster than thought. He launched himself from the dais, a blur of black fur and fury, placing his body between Ilara and the assassin. The dagger plunged into his side. A collective gasp of horror filled the throne room. The assassin stared, his eyes wide with shock at what he had done. Kaelin didn't even flinch. He grabbed the man's wrist, and the sound of bones shattering echoed in the stunned silence. The assassin screamed. Kaelin ripped the dagger from his own side and threw it to the floor. He looked down at the wound. It was not bleeding red. A thick black ooze seeped from the gash, and veins of blackness were already starting to spread across his skin. The blade was cursed. He swayed, his hand going to his side. A look of surprise crossed his face. He, who had not felt pain in 500 years, was feeling it now. He looked at Ilara, his silver eyes clouded with confusion and agony. "Kaelin," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and the great Alpha King collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Chaos erupted. Guards seized the screaming assassin. Courtiers shouted in panic, but Ilara saw none of it. She scrambled forward, to his side, her hands hovering over the terrible, spreading blackness of his wound. "Healers!" Valerius bellowed, his voice laced with a triumph he barely bothered to conceal. He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. "Seize the witch. This is her doing. She summoned this attack to murder our king." Hands grabbed her, yanking her away from Kaelin's still form. She fought, kicking and screaming his name, but they were too strong. They dragged her away, her last sight of him being the black ice creeping across his pale skin as the healers swarmed around him, their faces masks of despair. They threw her in the dungeons. Not a gilded cage this time, but a real one. Cold, damp stone, the drip of water a constant, maddening rhythm. The darkness was absolute. She didn't know how long she was there, hours or days. Time had lost all meaning. All she could see was his face as he fell, the surprise and pain in his eyes. He had saved her. He had taken a blade meant for her. And now he was dying. The thought was an agony worse than any physical pain. The tiny seed of hope in her heart had been ripped out, leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. She had brought this upon him. Valerius was right. Her very presence was a poison. She had woken something in the king, and in doing so had made him vulnerable. She huddled in the corner, the cold of familiar, unwelcome friend. But this cold was different. It was the cold of absolute despair. She had found a flicker of warmth in the endless winter of her life, and now it was being extinguished. And it was all her fault. Finally, she heard footsteps, the heavy clang of a key in the lock. The door creaked open, spilling faint torchlight into her cell. 2 guards stood there, their faces grim. "The council has reached a verdict," one of them intoned, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are to be brought before the king for final judgment." A flicker of hope, so faint it was almost painful, sparked within her. He was alive. He was well enough to pass judgment. They hauled her to her feet and marched her back up through the castle. But they didn't take her to the throne room. They took her to the king's private chambers. The room was filled with grim-faced council members, the pack healers, and Lord Valerius, who stood near the head of the bed, his expression one of solemn gravity. And on the bed lay Kaelin. Alara's breath hitched. This wasn't a recovery. This was a death watch. He was so pale, he seemed carved from marble. The black poison had spread from the wound, covering half his torso in a spiderweb of dark frozen veins. A visible frost coated his skin, and his breath came in shallow white puffs, as if he were breathing out the last of his life's warmth. "He is lost," one of the healers whispered, his voice thick with grief. "The cursed blade is consuming him. We have done all we can." Valerius stepped forward. "The king is dying," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "But before the winter takes him completely, justice must be served. He will pass judgment on the witch who brought this upon us." He looked down at Kaelin. "Your Majesty? Can you hear me? The Omega is here. Condemn her. Let your last act be one of justice for your pack." Slowly, as if through sheer force of will, Kaelin's eyes fluttered open. They were no longer silver, but a dull, cloudy gray. He looked around, his gaze unfocused, until it landed on her. Recognition dawned. The frost in his eyes seemed to recede for a moment. He tried to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. He lifted a hand, his fingers trembling, reaching for her. "Alara," he rasped, the single word a lifetime of regret and longing. That was it. That was the sound that broke her. He wasn't reaching to condemn her. He was reaching for her. In his final moments, he was seeking the warmth she had brought him. Something inside her snapped. The fear, the grief, the self-loathing, it all burned away, replaced by a single incandescent emotion. Rage. Rage at Valerius. Rage at the assassin. Rage at the curse. Rage at the cold, cruel world that would take him from her. "No," she whispered. The word was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the room. She tore herself from the guard's grasp with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She lunged for the bed, shoving past a stunned Valerius, ignoring the shouts of the council. She fell to her knees beside him. She took his freezing hand in both of hers. It was like holding a block of ice. "I will not let you die," she said, her voice shaking with the force of her will. She looked at the wound, at the black ice spreading across his chest. She thought of the rose bush, the spark of life she had coaxed from its dead branches. She placed her scarred hand directly over the wound, over the nexus of the curse. The cold was so intense, it was a physical pain, burning her skin. But she didn't pull away. She closed her eyes and sang. It was not the gentle lullaby of her mother. It was not a song of sorrow or longing. It was a song of defiance. A song of life itself, raw and untamed. It was a command, not a request. A demand that the darkness recede. A roar of light against the encroaching night. A golden light erupted from her hand. It wasn't a flicker. It was a sun. It blazed through the room, warm and brilliant, throwing the shocked faces of the council into stark relief. The light poured from her into Kaelin, a torrent of pure, liquid life. The black ice on his skin hissed and steamed, recoiling from her touch. The dark veins began to fade, driven back by the relentless tide of her power. The frost on his skin melted, turning to steam that rose into the air. Her voice grew stronger, the notes soaring, filled with a power she had never known. It was the power of creation, of healing, of a love so fierce it could stare down death and make it blink. The very stones of the castle seemed to vibrate with the force of her song. The light intensified, forcing the others in the room to shield their eyes. Valerius stared, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. What is this sorcery?" he stammered. But it wasn't sorcery. It was life. It was the antithesis of the cold, sterile power he dealt in. With a final, shattering note, the last of the blackness was purged from Kaelin's body. The light from Alara's hand faded, leaving her trembling and utterly drained. She slumped forward, her head resting on his chest, her energy spent. A deep, shuddering breath filled the silence of the room. Kaelin's eyes flew open. They were no longer cloudy gray or cold silver. They were the vibrant, piercing blue of a summer sky, alive with emotion. He sat up, his movements fluid and powerful, his gaze locking onto her. He touched her face, his fingers warm against her skin, actually warm. He could feel the softness of her cheek, the dampness of her tears. He could feel the frantic, steady beat of his own heart. He could feel everything, the curse, the numbness that had imprisoned him for 500 years, was shattered. "Alara," he breathed, and his voice was full of a wonder that eclipsed everything else in the room. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not an Omega, not a witch, but the other half of his soul. "It was always you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his warm, living chest. She felt the strength in his embrace, the steady thump of his heart against her ear. He was alive. He was warm. He was whole. Over her head, his gaze found Valerius. The advisor was frozen, his face ashen with the death of his plans. "You," Kaelin growled, and the sound was the rumble of an avalanche. All the power of the Alpha King was back, sharpened and honed by centuries of control, but now fueled by real burning emotion. "You poisoned my pack. You tried to murder your future queen. You laid a traitor's blade against me." He didn't need to raise his voice. Every word was a hammer blow. "Guards," Kaelin commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Take this filth to the deepest cell. He will await my judgment." The guards, who had been staring in stunned awe, snapped to attention. They seized Valerius, who began to blubber and protest his innocence, but his words were lost as they dragged him, struggling, from the room. The remaining council members were on their knees, their heads bowed to the floor in terror and reverence. They had witnessed a miracle, up to his. "They called you worthless," he said. "I'm not worthless. I'm a warrior." He gently tilted her face up to his. "They called you worthless," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They were blind. I was blind. I felt your warmth, but I didn't understand the sun that created it. I thought you were going to die," she sobbed, her hands clutching the front of his tunic. "And I would have," he said, his expression softening into something she had never seen on his face before. A smile. It transformed his harsh features, making him breathtakingly beautiful. "If not for you, you saved me, Alara. Not just from the poison, from the cold. You saved my soul." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a king claiming his prize. It was a drowning man taking his first breath. It was tender and fierce, a flood of gratitude and love and centuries of pent-up longing released in a single, perfect moment. In his kiss, she felt it all. The end of her loneliness, the birth of her strength, the undeniable truth that she, the Omega from the kennels, had a place. She was not nothing. She was his everything. And in her arms, he finally, after 500 years, felt like he was home. 3 months later, the first snows of winter began to fall, blanketing the northern kingdom in a pristine layer of white. But for the first time in centuries, the citadel of the Alpha King did not feel cold. Ilara, now the Alpha Queen, stood in the glass conservatory. The sun rose of Eldoria was in full, glorious bloom, its golden petals unfurling in the winter light, filling the air with a sweet, impossible fragrance. The other plants, once withered and dying, were now a riot of green life, thriving under her care. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, a stark contrast to the rags she had arrived in. But the true change was not in her clothes. It was in the way she held herself. Her shoulders were back, her head held high. The timid, frightened Omega was gone, replaced by a quiet, confident queen who knew her own worth. She had not forgotten where she came from. Her first royal decree had been the establishment of a proper sanctuary for the feral pups and any other outcasts of the pack. She visited them daily, not as a keeper, but as their patron, their queen. Her song, once a private comfort, was now a gift she shared freely, a source of healing and peace for all who heard it. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the familiar warmth of Kalen's chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on the railing. "Thinking?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Remembering," she corrected softly, "how cold it used to be." He tightened his embrace, his own warmth a constant living shield against the memory. Since the breaking of his curse, he was a different man. The cold, remote king was gone. In his place was a ruler of immense power and surprising gentleness, a man who laughed freely and loved fiercely. He was still the feared and respected Alpha King to his people, but to her, he was just Kalen. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you are never cold again," he vowed, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She looked into his vibrant blue eyes, now always so full of love for her. "You already have." He smiled, the smile that was still reserved only for her, and it made her heart sing more than any melody she knew. He had been her salvation, pulling her from the dirt and showing her she was worthy. And she had been his, a spark of life that had thawed his frozen heart and brought him back into the light. Their story was already becoming a legend whispered around hearthfires throughout the kingdom. The tale of the frozen king and the Omega who sang the sun back into his soul. But here, in the warmth of the conservatory, surrounded by life and light, they were not a legend. They were just a man and a woman who had found each other in the dark and had, against all odds, saved each other from the cold. And as he lowered his head to kiss her again, Ilara knew that their new world, a world they had built together, was only just beginning.